Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. The American economy generates a lot of facts and a lot of figures. Often they're more confusing than illuminating, more biased than impartial. How is the nation's economy doing? Have middle-class incomes gone up or down? Are the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? Is the federal government taking too much of your money? Can these questions be answered fairly and clearly? Joining us are two distinguished economists who specialize in fair and clear answers. Herb Stein, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Murray Foss, a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. We talk about their just published book, The New Illustrated Guide to the American Economy, this week on Think Tank. On this special edition of Think Tank, our guests are Herb Stein, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He was the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and is the author of many books, including On the Other Hand, Essays on Economics, Economists, and Politics, and The Fiscal Revolution in America. And Murray Foss, who is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors as a senior staff economist and has written many books on technical aspects of economics, including Changing Utilization of Fixed Capital. For today's program, we are using selected graphs based on their recent book, The New Illustrated Guide to the American Economy. Gentlemen, colleagues, Herb and Murray, tell me first, what was the purpose of this sort of book?
Well, we observe that there, as you say, an awful lot of discussion of the American economy, most of it, or a great deal of it, in complete ignorance of the facts. So we thought it was desirable to try to present some of the basic facts in an understandable, clear, and we hope dramatic, colorful way, in the hope that people would be able to discuss the economy and policy more intelligently.
And Murray, this is spin-free? Is that the idea?
Oh, this is absolutely spin-free. This is not a policy-oriented book. This is a broad outline, looking at the big picture of the American economy at a point of time, and in the perspective of, say, what happened since the end of World War II, and sometimes as far back as 1929.
Okay, let's go through some of the charts fairly quickly to lay out the general case, and then we will return for some brilliant cosmic philosophical notions. Okay, let's take a look at the first chart. This is consumption expenditures per person from 1950 to 1994. Herb Stein, what does that mean?
First, we should point out this is in real terms, that is, the effect of inflation has been taken out, and what we see is this enormous increase of that the per capita consumption expenditures are about 2.5 times as high as they were only 45 years ago.
They went from $6,000 per person to about $14,000 per person. So generally, our economy since World War II has been healthy.
Well, this is one sign of its health. That's what people get out of the economy.
Okay. Now, the next chart shows the growth rate of the American real gross national product, again, per person, from on a long telescopic view from 1869 on the left to 1994 on the right, divided into three periods. Murray, what is this telling us here?
Well, this shows that we've had, when you take very long periods of time, that we have had growth over the entire period. The first period, 1869 to 1948, is that bar on the left.
1.7% average annual growth.
Yes. Then the period from 1948 to 1973, we had a faster than average growth rate, at least compared to the historical picture. And from 1973 to 1994, there has been a slowdown in the rate of growth. That's not a decrease, that's just a slower rate of increase.
I think you have to say that that middle period was extraordinary. It followed a long depression and a great war, and it starts off then with us with a lot of unutilized opportunities for innovation, for technological progress, and with an enormous demand for output. So that was a peculiar period, but that doesn't mean that we should be entirely satisfied with what we've now got. We've got to see
that
whether
1.4%, I mean, we can do probably better than
we've
that.
got to see if we can. We don't know exactly what makes these things work, but we've got to try to make it better.
Now, the next chart deals with the American unemployment rate. Murray, why don't you march us through that one?
Since the end of World War II, we have had 9 recessions. Generally,
those are the little fluctuations we're seeing.
The rises in the unemployment rate would signify a recession. And
but everything has been within that 5 and 10% range.
That is correct. The severest recession we had in the post-World War II period was the 1974 downturn, and then the one we had in 1982. But it's interesting that these rates of unemployment are far lower than they were in the Great Depression that we had during the 30s.
Go ahead, Herb.
I think that's important to remind people, as we're getting a generation of people who have no memory of the Depression and what it was like, and it's useful to look there and see that at one point we had an unemployment rate of 25%. So that fear of depression, which has obsessed us for much of the post-war period, is important, but we have to recognize that it was very unusual.
Now, you were a young man during the Great Depression?
Pretty young, yes.
Pretty young. You were also a young man, or still an old child?
I was young.
You were young. Do you both remember the Great Depression? I mean, basically as adults already.
Yes. Well, I was in college during the worst days of the Depression, and I remember I lived in an industrial city, Schenectady, New York. There were just lots and lots of unemployed people. My father was unemployed a great deal of the time during the Depression, and here I was, a young student. I'd never found a job to work at during the summer except for one day hauling sacks in a grocery store. It was really tough.
What were you doing, Murray?
Well, I was a kid. I do remember. I really do remember the suffering in that period. I remember winters, for example, when we had a big snowstorm. This was greeted with great enthusiasm. Why? Because the young men, not me, but the young men could get jobs shoveling snow for $5 an hour, and this was a great thing.
$5 a day.
I'm sorry, $5 a day.
Right.
You see,
Yeah, right.
$5 a day.
Right.
And this was thought to be a terrific job, because if you worked 10 hours or 12 hours, you'd make $5 or $6 for the whole day. And that was a lot of money.
Gentlemen, you have collective experience in these economic vineyards. What did we figure out? Over 100 years. Over 100 years between the two of you. And remembering that Great Depression, do you think we could have something like that again?
I think it's extremely unlikely. Of course, we didn't have anything like that before the Great Depression either. That was worse than ever before or since. And I think we have learned some things. I think the economy is more internally stable and policy is wiser. And I think unless we totally forget everything, totally reject everything that we've learned, which is not impossible, I don't think it will happen again.
Murray, you buy that?
Well, I agree with that. You know, Franklin Roosevelt ran in 1932 on a platform of a balanced budget. The Federal Reserve shrank the money supply, just the opposite of the policy they should have followed. And there was just a lack of understanding on the part of politicians, bankers, economists.
Okay, I'm going to run out and call my broker, and then we'll. Now, let's move on to the next chart. And here we have something that there has been a lot of argument about recently. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics chart of real earnings in private industries. This is the chart that has been used, I have seen it again and again, or I've seen it referred to as making the case that since 1973, middle-class people in America are doing worse. This is basically the text of that.
And I think there are several things wrong with that conclusion. As Murray has said, it leaves out a lot of the American working population, but also it leaves out the fringe benefits.
Okay,
it leaves out the health care, the retirement benefits, and so on.
All right, now, when we put that in, let's put that chart up. That's the next one. And that shows what it looks like when you put all of that in, the health care and the pension plans.
Yeah, and of course that's becoming a more and more important part of total compensation, and workers want that in their compensation. And if you look at that, you see in this chart that although that wage earnings compensation has continued to rise, although also at a much slower rate than in the period before 1973.
Yeah, I think the chart brings out very clearly that the steepness of the line in the first part of the chart is much greater than it is in the second part of the chart.
And that would correlate with that chart we saw earlier showing that very rapid growth after World War II and a slower growth now.
That reflects the slowdown in the growth of productivity.
But it's not a decline, it's a slowdown in the rate of growth.
Yeah, it's as though we were going 30 miles an hour and now we're going 10 miles an hour, something like that.
Okay, now let's move on to the next chart and look at a somewhat grimmer situation. This is the poverty rate by race. The top line is the black rate, the bottom line is the white rate, and the middle line is the total rate for the United States. Would somebody care to describe what it shows?
One thing you have to say is that this is an extremely important case of inability to measure precisely what it is you would like to measure. That is, there are so many different possible definitions of poverty, which would range from about 8% of the population to 25% of the population. So I don't think there's much point in saying just how many people are in poverty. But what you can say, and I think all these measures do show these two things. First, that the decline in poverty, in the rate of poverty, which was very steep earlier in our history, has kind of leveled out, and the rate of poverty has been approximately stable for 15 or 20 years. And the other point is that the poverty rate among blacks is very much higher than the poverty rate among whites. It's consistently about twice as high.
How are black wages doing in comparison to white wages? That's one of the charts. We don't have it up there, but I know it's in the book.
Well, that is a very encouraging development. That is, for blacks with similar education, that's comparing blacks with 12 years of education with whites with 12 years of education, the gap has narrowed substantially in the post-war period. That is, they become more equal at every level of education, so that the lag of black incomes behind white incomes has been substantially reduced.
All right. Now we're going to take a look at one other view of this poverty population, which attempts to show why we have had this situation of non-diminishing poverty in recent decades. Can you march us through that one, Herb?
Yes. Well, the thing that stands out is that the proportion of the people in poverty who are in female-headed families has increased very greatly. That is, they used to be that about 25% of all the people in poverty were in female-headed families. Now it's about 35%. On the other hand, the proportion who are old has fallen substantially. And the reason that the proportion who are in female-headed families has increased so much is not because female-headed families are poorer than they used to be. They were always poorer than the rest of the population, but there are just a lot more of them relative to the total population.
So this is a social condition, female-headedness, a lot of divorce, a lot of out-of-wedlock birth, that is driving an economic indicator. Is that basically what we're talking about here?
That is correct. But we also see a social policy which is driving that decline in the proportion of the aged who are in poverty.
I mean, we have really bought our way out of elderly poverty by raising Social Security, I mean, in effect.
Yeah, well, You young people have bought us old people out.
Well, you are welcome, sir. No, I think that is the great example of social engineering that works.
Yes.
And insofar as welfare has been perhaps driving the other one, that is a great example of a social policy that doesn't work.
Yes, insofar as, that's a big debate.
Right. There was a famous Greek philosopher named Pericles Insopharis. No, okay. Now, so now let's go on to one other debate, which is the argument about inequality. And the question has been raised is, are the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? And this chart from your book shows what?
Well, it shows a small decline in the proportion of the income, of the national income, that is received by people in the lowest 20% of the income distribution, and an increase in the proportion of the income that is received by the people who are in the top 20% of the income distribution. Now, these changes, especially at the bottom, are very slight, but still they're a cause of concern. They need to be explained.
I mean, that bottom chart, the bottom line showing the bottom fifth of the income distribution has gone down from 6.4% of total income down to 5.5%.
Right.
So it's only a percentage point, but it's on a base of 6. Yeah. It's meaningful.
Yes, and of course the whole thing is very low. That is another thing to say. You have to say about it. But you have to understand several things about such calculations. They refer to the income earned in a particular year, and people's incomes fluctuate from year to year and over their lifetime. What we would like to know is what incomes people receive over their lifetime, and we know that that is much less unevenly distributed than the incomes that are received.
In other words, that bottom line might well include an intern in a hospital who is not making a lot of money now, just room and board and a few bucks, but we know in 10 years he is going to be your gallbladder specialist, and he's going to be making a lot.
That's right. It includes him if he's the head of a household, and one thing that has happened is that we have more households headed by young people than used to be the case, because people are moving out and setting up for themselves rather than living with their parents. That is one thing that's happening. Of course, the incidence, the increased frequency of female-headed families, which we noticed earlier, also affects these numbers. But something else is going on.
Yeah, let's see the next chart, which is the same chart but based on household expenditures rather than on income. And you might explain that distinction.
Well, we look at expenditures as possibly a better measure of people's income over a longer time than their actual reported income for a particular year, because if a person's income is fluctuating from year to year, he isn't going to cut his expenditures that's very much when his income falls, if he expects it to rise. So this is probably a better measure of the long-term status of people.
And this one shows for the bottom fifth a lesser diminution. The whole argument about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer seems to be within relatively small ranges.
I think that's right.
Okay.
Of course, the differences are still big, but of course people do differ greatly in various qualities.
Right. No, the absolute differences are huge, but they have not changed much, but they have changed some. I mean, that's
right.
Sort of it.
Yeah.
All right, now the one other great argument that's going on, which I know you are both very interested in, is this how much of our money is the government taking? And let's put that chart up, and perhaps you could, Herb Murray, who just sort of marches through that one, if you would.
Well, that shows the distribution of federal expenditures as a percentage of the GDP.
Federal revenues.
Federal revenues.
And that has remained, if you look at the top line,
well,
that has remained fluctuating, but at about the same rate.
At the top of that yellow band there, that represents the grand total.
Right, but the big increase has been not in the income tax, which is the bottom line, but in the payroll tax.
Payroll tax, that's the yellow area there.
Yeah, the total has fluctuated within range of between 18 and 20% of the national income. It only got up to the 20% during the Vietnam War, when we had a surcharge, and in the late 1970s when inflation was driving the taxes up. But by and large, except for the payroll taxes, which finance Social Security and Medicare, the tax burden has been declining.
Well, that is a case I have heard you make, but if we look at the next chart where we talk not about federal revenues, but about federal expenditures, and that has been going up. And the difference between the revenues and the expenditures, the top two lines, is what we call the deficit. You said the other day, I heard you, that you recently have had an epiphany about the deficit. So perhaps you could explain.
Well, should I explain what epiphany is?
Well, you could do that. We have a very high IQ audience
anyway,
here. But
I had a change of view about the deficit because I was rather complacent about it, even though it increased substantially during the years of our friend Ronald Reagan. Nevertheless, I thought that we were running the kinds of deficits that we could live with forever, and that remains true. What disturbs me now, what makes me a hawk about deficits, is the prospect that if we don't do something, those deficits which we see on the chart at around 2% or 3% of the GNP are going to go up to 15 or 20%, and that will really be calamity.
That the deficit would be 15 or 20%?
Absolutely.
Because of the cost of interest.
The cost of Social Security payments and Medicare payments, which are rising very rapidly. I might point out for people who can't see that chart very clearly.
So you want to cut your own Social Security check?
Oh, absolutely, and my Medicare more than that. But you'll see that the deficit line really fluctuates around zero until about 1974 or 1975, which is when Murray and I left the government.
Okay. 100 years of collective experience. We have gone through the past and the present. What happened? Where are we? What happens next? A little cosmic big thing.
I think what stands out is that this is a very strong economy. It's very productive. It gives us a higher standard of living as far as we can measure these things than anywhere else in the world. But it's also an economy that has some problems, which we've pointed to, problems that productivity is not rising, output per capita is not rising as fast as it used to, or as fast as we think it might be made to rise. And I would say particularly that there's a sector of the population that is not sharing in the general growth of welfare, that is being left behind. And I think that's a real problem for us, and ties in, as you suggested at one point, with many social problems. And so that we have to look at those things afresh, but and have to look at them within the context of a very successful economic system.
In the old days, the truly old days, economists were also philosophers. I mean, Adam Smith was not just an economist, he was a philosopher. Murray, would you like to say something philosophical as an overview, or Herb?
Well, I'm not sure I can say anything philosophical, but I am impressed by the lack of knowledge of a lot of basic facts about the economy. And I'm not talking about common sense. I think there's a lot of good sense out there on the part of the people, but I do think there is a serious lack of just basic facts.
The discussion of economics is highly politicized. Almost all the economists that you ever hear about are aligned. They're Democrats or Republicans, they're liberal or they're conservatives, and they tell a story using these figures. And of course, another thing is that the media generally is interested in the news, which is what happened last month or last week, and that is not the way to look at the American economy. You have to look at the American economy over a longer period in order to have any reasonable judgments about it.
Okay, thank you, Herbert Stein and Murray Foss, and thank you. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. come. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.